So welcome, 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 our brilliant, beloved colleague, Delilah. We so appreciate your consistent leadership and solidarity. And as always at SETC, we begin all things by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So Delilah, can you please share a bit about your remarkable work and introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Victor. And I really appreciate that amazing opening that you shared that's full of gratitude. I'm very grateful to be with you here today and to be connecting with all of your community. So my name is Delilah Rothenberg, and I am a co-founder and the executive director of the Predistribution Initiative. Although if you look at my Twitter or X, I say I'm some collection of stardust at some, I think I said moment in time or something. So I'm not defined by the Predistribution Initiative, but the Predistribution Initiative is my main focus right now. And it's a nonprofit that I and a few colleagues started in 2019 officially. We started working on it in 2018. And it's a nonprofit that's designed to support investors, to work with our stakeholders, and co-creating new ways to share more influence and wealth with workers and communities. And we really focus on investment governance, the way investors govern themselves, the way they think about risk, return, and value, the financial analysis tools that they use to better account for human, social, and natural capital. And then we also think about investment structures and how risk and return are distributed through those investment structures. So that's our work at a high level.
That's incredible. Well, as you know, we've connected a couple of times. I'm a big fan of your work, and I love the humility in terms of, framing out, but I love that Stardust piece. Definitely, I don't think any of us are defined by our roles, but nowadays it seems like increasingly the way our work is, I guess, articulates to the world. Folks are kind of defined by their roles and their titles. So I love the fact that you added that caveat and just shared your remarkable background and the context of your work. So my next question is, what's inspiring you right now? What has you curious, or what's keeping you up at nights?
I'll build a little bit on the previous question as I transition to answering this question. My background is in finance, and I started my career in public equities on the sell side. I was at Bear Stearns during the financial crisis. But I was really interested in finding the whole reason why I went into finance in the first place, actually, was because I was interested in attracting capital to underserved areas of the world like sub-Saharan Africa. And so by the time the financial crisis came around, I had learned about the different asset classes. I didn't study finance in school, so I learned on the job. And I learned about private equity and venture capital and figured that that was probably a better space to focus on supporting small, medium-sized enterprises in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I got into that space, and I learned a lot over time. I didn't only focus on sub-Saharan Africa. I ended up also focusing on developed markets. And I just learned that the structure of investments really, the way we think about risk, return, and value, the way we structure the investments really inhibits capital and a fair pricing of capital to go to small, medium-sized enterprises, to go to economically distressed areas or less developed areas. Wealth and capital sort of already concentrate where centers of gravity exist. And so I've become very interested in how to move capital to be more regenerative and to reach the real economy. And I'm really excited right now about emerging investment structures that we're seeing in the impact investing space, as well as mainstream finance that focus on worker ownership or community ownership of both companies and real assets. So if you think about infrastructure or real estate, in addition to operating companies that produce products and services. And then also alternatives to venture capital like revenue-based financing and redeemable equity. And then, also we're exploring questions around financial benchmarks because investors evaluate their performance often relative to a financial benchmark that is it does not reflect really what we believe would be the true cost of human, natural, and social capital. And so the financial benchmarks might be inflated. And so if you're constantly trying to meet or exceed that financial benchmark, then it's really difficult for you to actually invest in a way that's really sustainable moving forward and reduces negative externalities.
I couldn't agree more. And once again, I appreciate your leadership and your candor around some of this, because I think that a lot of folks, when they think about value, like it's oftentimes people know the price of everything, but the value of nothing, or even the cost of anything. And I think the way you're framing it is very helpful in terms of how we move to more regenerative economies as opposed to these extractive frameworks that we've had for such a very long time. So once again, I appreciate your leadership and diligence. So my next question is, what challenges and barriers are you facing in your work? What are some of the approaches your colleagues are taking to overcome some of these challenges and barriers?
Yeah, I would say that the challenges and barriers primarily relate to, I think, a public consciousness and systemic sort of force that exists that prevents people from thinking about risk, return, and value differently. So for instance, if you talk to an institutional investor about changing the way they interpret their fiduciary duty to that they evolve their fiduciary duty to not only focus on optimizing the risk-adjusted return of each individual portfolio company, but really looking at their entire diversified portfolios and recognizing that there are system-level risks like inequality and climate change and biodiversity loss that might threaten their diversified financial performance. So they're moving from sort of single financial materiality to system-level materiality. It can be hard for these investors to do because there's such a focus on short-termism in the market. And what's my return going to be in the near term? And I'm not just talking about quarterly reporting, which lots of people will say is the issue. Even in asset classes or in investments that have longer time horizons, you're 3-5 years is not a long time frame. Even 10 years isn't a long time frame when you think about system level risk manifesting and how they might affect your diversified portfolios in the longer run. And so I think that when you talk to these institutions like a pension fund, for instance, and they're thinking about, well, what do their beneficiaries want from them? You talk to the retirees, they'll say, well, I want my return to be as high as it possibly can be, right? In the near term, if you have a set pension, then there's really only, for institutional investors, they really only have to cover their liabilities, right? They don't need to maximize their returns. Educate people more about that dynamic and also systemic risk and return and value.
Yeah, I find that a lot of folks, so one of my colleagues doing a lot of work in employee ownership, and he engaged the Maple Eights, the largest pension funds in Canada. And their aversion to risk was interesting. But not only that, like I find that a lot of times we don't look at the fact that pension funds are the stewards of the wealth, the 99%. And the way those resources are allocated is quite odd based off of some of the challenges that we have systemically. So when you talk about investment horizons, like if you look at the social finance fund, Canadian fund, $755 million, it's a 15-year investment horizon. And that's a federal fund. So you'd think that there'd be greater leadership from some of the institutional investors like pension funds around some of the real challenges that we're having on the front lines of community economic development and community finance. But I really feel that there needs to be some a calling in and a calling out of some of these institutional investors and how they actually allocate capital and where and really looking at the impact measurements and performance. Like what is the impact? Because I know that there are a lot of folks that have been able to do a lot more with a lot less. And the hoarding of capital and flowing capital to traditional frameworks and models that don't work well for all people is antiquated and still and problematic. Yeah. So I couldn't agree more. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just on that point, if we have a little bit of time to explore that some more, I think that just the way the system is designed makes it difficult for these institutions to change the way they're doing things. I mean, if you think about, again, sort of their KPIs and how often they need to evaluate performance in order to retain staff, they might be long-term investors without into the future, but the staff typically, it's very difficult practically to evaluate staff on their investment performance on anything too long, right? Like practically speaking, it's often a 1 or 3 or 5 year time horizon. It's difficult to structure that differently. And so I think that there's interest and an appetite among institutional investors to do things differently, but there aren't really clear answers. There aren't also good financial analysis tools to actually evaluate systemic risk and return. And so those still need to be developed. And then one of the other major barriers is that we also haven't really mapped all the pathways through which the private sector, both companies and investors, contribute to system level risks like inequality and climate change and biodiversity loss, and by how much. And then there's more work that's been done on climate change and increasingly now on biodiversity, but certainly if you think about inequality, the work just isn't, the research just really isn't there to support the investors in thinking about how they need to adjust their own practices.
Yeah, well, I think as the world moves towards censoring justice, access, inclusion, diversity, decolonization, equity, I think there'll be more, I guess, case studies and research or evidence-based practices that kind of raise awareness, because obviously we know that we have a lot of climate disclosure frameworks coming down the pipelines for a lot, which is scary and a lot of anxiety and trepidation amongst some major institutions. But when you think about industrialization, globalization, land back movements, the transatlantic slave trade, there's so many things that created the dynamic of capitalism that we have today. And I think sometimes a blind eye is turned to like how wealth was originally accumulated in a lot of cases, and how there can be that countervailing balance in terms of, okay, yep. and once again, like I said before, it's interesting because there's a pension fund that invested and lost a lot of money in crypto. I'm not going to name the pension fund, obviously. This is like maybe 2 years ago. And I'm thinking like that passed the litmus test, but other things like, you know what I mean, it can't. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And once again, I just appreciate your leadership, your candor, and your remarkable analysis of some of the things that just can't be done because of how the system's structured currently. And once again, it speaks to the systemic transformation that's needed. But once again, as we know, systemic transformation is very incremental, and systems lens investing is also very incremental. So my next question, do you have a set of key priorities right now in your work?
Yes, well, we have 4 work streams, and the first is on transparency, standard setting, and disclosure. And so that's focused on developing measurement and management tools for investors and companies to evaluate how they're contributing to system level risks and how system level risks are affecting them. And if you think about the frameworks that we've used in the past, well, when I was in finance, was working with SASB and GRI and IRIS Plus, they're very focused on portfolio company operations and products and services, and there hasn't been that much focus on investors. And so that work stream is really designed to look at how investors are impacting or influencing these kinds of impacts, what their dependencies are, what the risks and opportunities are related to that. And we're part of a consortium of organizations working to launch a task force on inequality and social-related financial disclosures. We've also worked on projects with the Impact Management Project, with Impact Frontiers on this, with the Investment Integration Project. And so we look forward to taking that work and advancing it. We also have 2 middle work streams that are focused on reforming investment governance and financial analysis tools. So reforming investment governance to really shift the interpretation of fiduciary duty to account for these new ways of valuing human, social, natural capital, thinking about systemic materiality as opposed to single financial materiality. And then the part on financial analysis is really co-creating tools to financial analysis tools to actually be able to do this value-related work differently, to change the way we think about pricing and allocating capital. And then the last work stream is around producing research around what are more regenerative investment structures. and what are pathways to get more capital to the real versus financialized economy, and co-creating or building on different models and working to scale them with impact integrity. And so it's sort of all of our work streams are like a circle or a loop. They each support one another. And if you think about what are you going to measure and manage, then going back to the first work stream, well, you're going to measure and manage investment governance, financial analysis, approaches to financial analysis, like, or how are you doing it in line with the concept of intergenerational fiduciary duty, and measuring and managing what kinds of investment structures we're using, and are they more or less regenerative?
Regenerative is one of my favorite words. My wife is an agroecologist, and a lot of times I find that we use ecological terms like ecosystem and regenerative in the finance sector, social finance, and impact investing, but we sometimes forget how to apply them. And I think that you're a remarkable example of how to actually apply some of the things that are just so obvious, and some of the tools that have been used since time immemorial, but now can actually impact the financial sector in a way that makes sense for people and for communities. So once again, I applaud your leadership and all the tools and frameworks that you and your colleagues are building out. So my second last question, what is your ultimate goal, and what does success look like and feel like to you and your colleagues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, our ultimate goal is really supporting an evolution of the way the financial system is structured and operates so that it does get more capital to the real economy in more regenerative ways. And when I say regenerative, I mean it, as you alluded to, both in the ecological sense, but also recognizing that people are part of nature. And so it's really working toward more balance and harmonization between all living things, and reforming finance so that it can support that. I think there's only so much finance can do as well, and we really need to support a shift in public consciousness to recognize that focusing on the individual and the success of the individual, it's a concept that people have really centered, particularly in the United States and increasingly globally. But the individual cannot be successful in the near or long term if their community and their ecosystem that they're a part of, their social ecosystem, their, as we think about natural being different, natural ecosystem, that needs to be healthy for us to really thrive, both in a physical sense and in a financial sense. And we'd like to support that transformation in public consciousness. And I do think it means moving beyond a conversation in the world of finance to really, having conversations with people who aren't in finance, who are affected by finance, who would like to see their lives be different. And I'm not just talking about liberals, but also conservatives. I think that, there's conservative populists have very valid concerns about being left behind. And if we can all sort of just engage with one another with empathy and try to find more balance in the system, I think it will really reduce polarization and also bring us peace.
I couldn't agree more. One of my colleagues recently said, Anouk from Future of Good, she was saying folks need that disagree with each other need to find ways to sit down and have a good conversation. I think that's, like you said, the word empathy is so important in these conversations, and as well, grace and mercy and compassion. I think that if we have more grace, mercy, compassion, empathy for each other as it relates to our political leanings or our point of views or our values, then at least we can find some common ground. Because I find that a lot of times people have an opinion on everything. When it comes to economics, you need to be an economist to have an opinion. Well, no, like that's the most absurd thing ever. You know what I mean? Like we should be able to have candid conversations on the state of our economy, and share values around collectivism and cooperation as opposed to individualistic frameworks that usually lead us to our own terminating or just our own destruction. And the fact remains that capital markets are terminating us in various ways. And until we can have some candid conversations around how we can make steps to making our economies safer, but also future-proofing and creating safety for those that are impacted by shifts or even feel trepidation and anxiety around some of the shifts to the economy, we're in trouble. So once again, grace, compassion, empathy, and mercy, these should be pillars in terms of any conversations between conservatives, liberals, politics, faith groups, whatever side you are on
Absolutely.
around polarization, you know. But yeah, once
Yep.
again, I appreciate your leadership and just raising that political or public consciousness in this time. So my last question, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers?
Yeah, I think, Victor, I really appreciated what you just said. And it brings to mind the importance of focusing on socioeconomic inequality, because from what I've seen in my lifetime and learning about, you know, my heritage and my family's history, and then also just other communities' histories and what's going on in the world right now, I think that when we have socioeconomic inequality, it can lead to scapegoating, and that increases polarization. And so I think that's also a major reason to focus on reducing socioeconomic inequality, because that will also help just reduce tensions and people's anxiety about their own economic security, and open them up to be able to have more empathetic and kind conversations with one another.
Ashe, ashe, ashe. I couldn't agree more. Delilah, thank you so much for your consistent solidarity, your remarkable and visionary leadership, and your authenticity that you bring to this work. And yeah, I'm honored to call you my colleague. I just appreciate all that you do for so many. And as always at SETC, we close this conversation the way we began it, by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toil without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Delilah. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Victor. I appreciate you and everyone you mentioned as well.